Before I discovered alchemy, I had a series of dreams which repeatedly dealt with the same theme. Beside my house stood another, that is to say, another wing or annex, which was strange to me. Each time I would wonder in my dream why I did not know this house, although it had apparently always been there. Finally came a dream in which I reached the other wing. I discovered there a wonderful library dating largely from the 16th and 17th centuries. Large, fat folio volumes bound in pigskin. Among them were a number of books embellished with copper engravings of a strange character, and illustrations containing curious symbols such as I had never seen before. At the time I did not know to what they referred. Only much later did I recognize them as alchemical symbols. In the dream I was conscious only of the fascination exerted by them, and by the entire library. It was a collection of medieval incunabula and 16th century prints. The unknown wing of the house was a part of my personality, an aspect of myself. It represented something that belonged to me, but of which I was not yet conscious. It, and especially the library, referred to alchemy, of which I was ignorant, but which I was soon to study. Some 15 years later, I had assembled a library very much like the one in the dream.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to our guests of the Ritman Library, Sonu Shamdasani, Peter Forshaw, Hans van den Hooff. I would like to give Jung the floor first. My idea is to offer you a few quotes to let him, so to say, speak for himself and invite you to comment on some of his ideas. And of course I would like to start with the Red Book. And I quote Jung, "I worked on the Red Book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. The beginning of the end came in 1928, when Wilhelm sent me the text of The Golden Flower, an alchemical treatise. There, the contents of this book found their way into actuality, and I could no longer continue working on it. With the help of alchemy, I could finally arrange them into a whole." So Sonu, how did Jung discover alchemy and why was it so appealing to him?
Well, first to note that Jung was always a good storyteller, that he's first familiar with alchemy from the time of his reading for Transformations in Symbols Libido in 1911-1912, makes some references through his works. And his first turn in 1929, when he publishes The Secret of the Golden Flower, as commentary to that with Richard Wilhelm, is to the East. And it's really only in about 1934-35 that his engagement with alchemy in a major way gets underway. There's first what he calls this Eastern intermezzo. And it's interesting to note because in certain ways part of the template that he's developing for his understanding of alchemy is developed in his reading of Eastern texts. And that he then, in terms of the notion of a symbolic, or a process of transformation having its depictions in symbols in the way in which you could correlate these two, becomes transferred onto alchemy as a form of Western yoga. But he's first developed this kind of hermeneutics in his engagement with Eastern texts. The significance of alchemy, to go back to 1928-29, he finds himself in a quandary. He's been engaged in just a secret experiment that's only known to people he's initiated into it. It's an esoteric experiment. He's not spoken publicly about it. He's tried to initiate and to foster similar processes in his patients, and he's not published this either. And there's a question, is this just something that he's cooked up himself? Is this just down to suggestion and auto-suggestion? Or is there something more than that? Is there a historical analogue? Is there something wider than that? And as he says, that the text that Wilhelm sends him breaks him out of this isolation and for him resolves this quandary. Yes, there is a parallel, as he saw it, between the centering process depicted in this text and the significance that he was finding in these circular forms to which he adopted the term mandala. And the issue vis-a-vis alchemy was that he felt that it had a particular historical significance in the West. The only way to substantiate his psychology was through history and cross-cultural historical comparative study of symbolic processes. And alchemy was then the main element that he concentrated on as having the most significance in the West. And also he ultimately saw his own psychology as a continuation of taking up the, you could say, psychic legacy of alchemy. So just to take this image of Philemon, stemming initially from Ovid's Metamorphoses via Goethe's Faust. The statement here you have, is written in English, citation from the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita says, "Whenever there is a decline of the law and an increase of iniquity, then I put forth myself for the reform of the pious and for the destruction of the evildoers, for the establishment of the law. I am born in every age." One of the questions Jung's posing, and is posed in a way for historians as to who is Jung's Philemon, is the question of, is this figure particular to himself? Is it his own invention? Or is what he's in touch with there something that belongs to something more broadly and collectively human? And then Jung's answer is that it is. And there we have this, again, this the parallel being provided there by the Bhagavad Gita.
Well, that's a wonderful connection with another quote I chose, and that's from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And Jung says, or writes there, "Only after I had acquainted myself with alchemy did I realize that the unconscious is a process, and that the psyche is transformed or developed by the relationship of the ego to the contents of the unconscious. In individual cases, that transformation can be read from dreams and fantasies. In collective life, it has left its deposit principally in the various religious systems and their changing symbols. Through the study of these collective transformation processes and through understanding of alchemical symbolism, I arrived at the central concept of my psychology, the process of individuation." So Hans, as a psychotherapist, what is most useful to take from Jung's ideas on about alchemy and the process of individuation?
Well, you see, Esther, I think Jung saw alchemy as a language. He's been, as a psychiatrist, early in his career working with people in the psychiatric clinic in the Burgholzli, where there were often, psychotic people speaking their psychosis and their bizarre fantasies. He was in a way like a physicist, trying to have a frame for physical phenomena, like the famous apple falling from the tree, understanding the electromagnetic, the gravitational forces in physics. He was interested in looking at psyche also as a kind of a mechanism, or as a kind of a frameable dynamic, let me use those words. And I think that the ultimate meaning for Jung that he found in alchemy was that it gave him a metaphorical language for transformational processes that he has also experienced in working, with his patients. So what perhaps is mathematics to physics is maybe alchemy to psychology for you. For example, the solutio process, where in alchemy we see images of a drowning king, which correspond maybe to the experience that you see with psychiatric and psychotic patients. They are disappearing, And today in modern science, where we only frame experience in rational categories, we don't have a framework to frame the depth of psyche. And we have processes like solutio, as I just said, disappearing in the water, but also the separatio, to distinguish the ego from the rest of the unconscious. The coagulatio, where we are slowly evaporating all the moisture until we are much cleaner and solid, and all the moisture disappears, which causes shrinking, which is, by the way, an explanation why the Americans call a psychiatrist a shrink.
Yeah. And Hans, your favorite experience?
Well,
the king in the sweatbox. Let's go to see it.
The king in the sweatbox.
This is one of the works that Jung had, Michael Meyer.
Yeah. We see here a king. He is in a sweatbox. He still has his crown on, so that we know that he is a king. But there's a fire underneath it and steam coming from everywhere. And he needs to be, as the text says, demoisturized. And we can compare that with people who are full of swollen complexes, as Jung calls them there, identifying the ego with other unconscious stuff, and that's the de-identification from that. So the letting go of all the moisture, the shrinking of psyche to more powdery, white powder, as Senior, one of the alchemists, calls it.
There's also in Memory Streams Reflections. There's a quote. And Jung says, when I began to understand alchemy, I realized that it represented the historical link with Gnosticism. And that continuity, therefore, existed between the past and present. Grounded in the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages, alchemy formed the bridge, on the one hand, into the past, to Gnosticism, and on the other into the future, to the modern psychology of the unconscious. So my question to you is, in fact, because alchemy seems to become more and more popular, and the interest in Jung's ideas as well, what, according to you, is the relevance of alchemy and in the present day?
Okay. That's interesting for a guy who spends his life with his nose in 16th and 17th century books to the present day. In Jung's last major work on alchemy, he returns to the fact that alchemy is a fantastic treasure house of symbols. And I think that's what's still relevant, that still keeps people finding something of interest and of inspiration in alchemy. And those images give a different perspective, both on how alchemists, scientists of their day communicated knowledge, but also of extremely vibrant, really, for people looking at the images today as well, on a different level, with different sciences, for example, psychologists looking at them, because they touch on a lot of areas of human experience which are actually often swept under the carpet. There are sort of pathological images of incest, for example, and cannibalism and skeletons there, and so it lets you touch on areas maybe which aren't usually the standard discussion in the drawing room, for example. I mean, one thing that springs to mind is, for example, in an esoteric library is tarot. You get Aleister Crowley is famous for his Thoth tarot deck, and the image of temperance is the art. He's renamed it that, and it's the art of alchemy. But people like Robert Plass are doing alchemical tarot decks and things like that. But also it spreads into literature. I mean, from very early on, The Chemical Wedding. We're in a Rosicrucian library. The Chemical Wedding is a very famous text inspired by alchemy. In the 20th century, you have The Chemical Wedding of Lindsay Clark. Earlier, you have Frankenstein of Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is reading Paracelsus for his ideas. And then, right into the present day, you've got Harry Potter, for example, where I love it, the fact that Dumbledore's partner in alchemy is Nicolas Flamel. You know, I hope J.K. Rowling, hello J.K. Rowling, write a short story on their escapades. It'd be fantastic. But also in the area of music, we've got Damon Albarn, that opera of Dr. Dee, inspired by the English alchemist, John Dee. We have Alan Moore, who collaborated with him, doing amazing comics now, Prométhée, which has got alchemical and Kabbalistic and magical influences. What else have we got? We've got, revivals of Michael Myers' music, Atalanta Fugien's, which you know, that 17th century book, which has got images, 50 alchemical images and 50 pieces of music. Friends of ours are doing those performances. Les Canards Chantants, the Singing Ducks. The Ensemble Plus Ultra have recorded as well. So it's interesting that alchemy is clearly inspiring music. It's inspiring theatre. Ben Jonson is still popular with The Alchemist in England. You've got literature and art as well, and that shows that these metaphors or myth themes of transformation, of metamorphosis, and so forth are there. And on top of that, of course, is the psychology. And historians of science will probably want to smack me for saying it, but alchemy has gone through transformations and transmutations throughout history, from the 3rd century in Alexandria right up to the present day. And alchemy has changed. In the Middle Ages, it was making the Philosopher's Stone, and then in the 16th century, it starts becoming chemical medicines. Paracelsus, the Swiss author whom Jung was delighted to write about, is often classed as the father of homeopathy. So you've got Jung inspiring practices to do with psychotherapy, but also supporting the New Age in many of its interests in things like alternative medicine. And
talking about sources, it's wonderful that we can set out a lot of these books that he had access to, that he had collected himself.
Mm-hmm.
All the works of course, in the first place, Hermes and Paracelsus and Dornius and all the others. What do you think, or is this known, would be the most favorite amongst them? And that's maybe a question for all of you.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's, to me, interesting is his working method, in that he basically constructed an encyclopedia of alchemy for himself, in terms of assembling quotations and then highlighting terms and indexing them. And this encyclopedia was what he constructed all of his works out of. And in certain ways you could actually use it to construct new works as a virtual, it's still a working scholarly tool in these alchemy copybooks. So that you then begin to grasp his working method. That is, being able to develop an argument and then immediately look under certain terms in terms of the relevant quotations. It also shows why he's working in a mode that's decontextualized and dehistoricized, because he's working on cross-cultural, trans-historical symbolisms, what he's trying to grasp. So in a way, it's not to me that single works, but in a way he's trying to get at the root of who is, in a way, the hidden author behind that, and his argument is that hidden author is still present in contemporary dreaming.
Yeah. I found that interesting. I mean, okay, I've not looked at the copybooks, you have, but from the book you wrote on Jung's biography in books, there it seems primarily that he's wordy. He's going through the words of alchemy. I mean, and he's making an index of terms, of alchemical terms. Does he ever have a sort of image library as well? Because he's clearly inspired by the visual image as well. I mean, they turn up in his collected works.
He's collecting images.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, at one point he's sending Olga Frober Captain to the British Museum to collect images and say, do not tell anyone what work you're doing, what you're doing it for. Yeah. So yes, he's scouting for images as well. His spies are digging around for him.
And I think that making that encyclopedic inventory of alchemical imagery and texts that Sonu has pointed to also illustrates that that mapping attitude that he had. And we can almost compare that little booklet with all his quotes from the different alchemical sources to the chemical periodic table, where you have a very well structured document to somehow grasp almost the ungraspable. It's I think on that. And what he's really, I think, fascinated by is that he's deeply convinced that corresponds to somehow the laws of the unconscious.
Yes. I mean, for me as a historian, what I like is that looking at the copybooks, the images that you provide, he's adopting an alchemical methodology. I mean, the Rosarium Philosophorum, if people ask which images are really important with Jung, it's that very famous series from the 1550 Rosary of the Philosophers, where you've got the king and the queen, the man and the woman, sleeping together, and there are deaths in different senses of the word, not just the Shakespearean sense, where they dissolve in an acid bath, and then they're shown in a tomb with the spirit or the soul separating from the body and then coming back down again. But that whole text is a florilegium. It's a collection of quotes from different alchemical sources. And Jung's sort of perpetuating that. And in a way, I have to say, I really like that you can see how alchemists of different centuries are mystified by the tradition that they're working in. And they're trying to crack this code. And he's doing something similar. But what he's doing is he's allowing for different dimensions or levels of reading. And you find that, even in alchemy, you find alchemists who adapt Kabbalah trying to crack the code, others who are trying with numerology to decipher what's going on. And so Jung really is, I like to say, it's a 21st century alchemy. There are not alchemy, there's not just alchemy as a monolith. Historians of science say there are alchemies. And certainly I'd say Jung is one kind. It's one of the latest manifestations of that.
It extends beyond that in terms of method, because his alchemical works, if one may call it that, are themselves allegorical. In a way, it's important to suspend the referent, because the prime subject or the prime referent is the transformation process. What he himself has undergone and fostered in his patients. He's using alchemical texts as a mode of allegorical writing. In the same way that alchemists often use allegory and assembling quotations as a way of speaking of the secrets of the transformation processes. So in a way, his texts are themselves double-sided. On the one hand, they purport to be about medieval alchemy. The real subject, the true art, is the transformation process, of which he's decided not to speak. He's kept that veiled. There are only a few people that he's letting on to that. And in a way, you can only understand that double layer, that hidden layer of his alchemical texts following the publication of Liber Novus. Because there you find the hermeneutic key that he didn't publish in his lifetime of his own transformation process. And in a way, that's something that historians of science haven't bothered to even begin to understand of how you actually are supposed to read these texts.
I mean, I'm being cheeky. Is there any, in the Red Book, is there any intimation of at least engaging with themes that he later develops in alchemy, or through alchemy?
Well, one of the main themes in that is the question of the resolution of the conflict of opposites. And also the cosmology of how is the universe constructed, what is the place of opposites within that, which finds its major culmination in Mysterium Conjunctionis. He's trying to create a text that itself that stimulates the imagination, that evokes the processes which it's starting to describe.
I mean, one of the questions I always have, and I don't have an answer for it, so maybe you do, is, I mean, if you think with alchemy, he's adopting the analogy of alchemy. And alchemy, I mean, alchemists themselves often say, I haven't got to the Philosopher's Stone yet. I've got to a sort of a preparatory stage, or at least I know what matter I've got to work with. But sometimes there's the sense that, yes, you can create lesser stones, but the Philosopher's Stone always eludes you. It's always out of reach. So if that's what a lot of alchemists are saying, I mean, to what extent is Jung paralleling that? Does he feel, for example, individuation or the conjunctio ever can take place, or is that not the point?
I think his understanding is that it's an ongoing process and that ultimately goes beyond the grave.
Okay.
So, and he ultimately does become convinced of, in his personal life, of reincarnation.
Okay.
And the sense that you, in a way, incarnate when the questions that are posed to you that you are in a position to take up.
That's interesting.
And that in a certain sense that it's what I call its theology of the dead. The questions, what one is engaged in, which one thinks is self-directed in terms of the questions and topics and issues one chooses in one's life, are in a way an attempt to answer questions posed by one's ancestors.
Okay.
I have never, but I'm just an average reader, I've never sensed a strong drive or need in Jung to find the stone.
Okay.
I think he was also a bit of a phenomenologist. He was in the Liber Novus, or what led to the Liber Novus was a clear, almost microscopic perspective of what came to him from the depth of the unconscious.
Yeah.
And he sort of accurately, as a good academic, wrote that down to be. That's my understanding of what drove him more to be true and to be objective and to write it down and to codify, rather than to achieve a certain stone. But I don't know if you agree with that.
I agree that the issue, and it's there quite clearly in Liber Novus in the Black Books, the notion of what I call fidelity to the event.
Right.
He's attempting to note down what is taking place.
Exactly. As an objective histologist almost.
Liber Novus is a bit different because he's trying to then elaborate a work, a literary work on the basis of that. But the first notations in the Black Books, they're dated entries. He's reflecting on his mental states. Also, I think with an understanding that something of what's going on has import, that it concerns not just himself.
No, it's objective manifestations.
It's in a way it's someone that is undergoing a process, and it is a process of religious transformation. But he becomes more interested in understanding the psychology of the religion-making process.
Yes.
How are religions formed on the basis of on the basis of an individual's primary experience, how do symbols arise? How do they become codified? How do sects arise? These are the sorts of issues he becomes interested in.
What I find very fascinating is to ask all of you about the parallels that you see between alchemical transformation and human transformation.
It's such a big subject, and it's also very important to note from which perspective are we answering this question. Is it from the initiate, so who has been through the process already and who can look back on what has happened to him or her, or is it from the one who comes in the first time in the therapist's room, with stress or anxiety or depression or other problems? But from the perspective of somebody who has been through that process, in alchemy we talk about solution. I've talked already about it. It's losing yourself. But then it talks about also the mortificatio, so that we have something has to die in ourselves before we can, really develop further and find energies in ourselves. Very important is the final alchemical step, namely the conjunctio. It's the bringing back of the parts in us which we have separated before, but not too soon. So do the alchemists teach us, because then we have the lesser conjunctio. Then we are going to put back that what has not been fully separated yet. Well, in human beings, you know, we can sometimes think that we are making whole, but we have not split it yet sufficiently. So there's plenty of those kind of analogies, and so that's my take on it, Esther.
Jung was interested in how religions were made. I'm interested in how psychologies were made. So to the first question, on one sense, I don't have a clue as to the parallels between alchemy and human transformations. That's not my question. But what interests me is to say that, okay, you have various, what you could call ontologies of transformation. You have various systems that in this case, of how a process of transformation has symbolic depictions. And in the case of Jung, it's become a cultural form itself, as Peter was saying, in the sense that you've had over 75 years of this in the culture. People have been engaging in this practice, as Hans would be able to sort of speak to far more interestingly than myself. Now, my interest is to say, okay, how are these systems themselves put together? How do we arrive at this point, say, a psycho-alchemy that is a prevalent cultural form in the 20th century? What effects do they have? How do they compare with other cultural forms, other forms of transformation?
I would like to thank you very much, and I'm sure that not only me but also our audience would like to see this conversation continued. Maybe that will be the case. Thank you for this moment very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Esther.
Yeah.